You need a friend and our dad needs a wife, 8-year-old Emma said with the startling honesty only children possess. Margaret's heart nearly stopped as she knelt in her garden, staring into those innocent brown eyes. What seemed like a sweet moment between neighbors was about to unleash a storm of lies, betrayal and greed that would tear apart everything. This small town thought it knew about family, honor, and truth. Because sometimes, y'all, the most innocent words spoken by a child can expose the darkest secrets hidden in a community. And when Margaret finally stood before the packed town hall months later, clutching a yellowed letter that would change everything, she realized those children's simple request had been the first domino in a chain of events that would either destroy a family forever or give them the chance to rebuild on a foundation of truth. Margaret's hands were covered in rich, dark soil as she tended to her small garden behind the modest house she'd called home for the past 3 years. The afternoon sun felt warm on her shoulders, and for a moment, just a moment, she allowed herself to feel something close to peace. Lord knows she'd earned it after everything she'd been through. "Ma'am?" A small voice called from behind the wooden fence. She turned to see 2 pairs of curious eyes peeking through the slats. 8-year-old Emma and her 6-year-old brother Jake were standing there, their faces serious in that way children get when they're about to say something important. These were the Miller kids from next door, the ones who'd lost their mama to cancer 2 years back. "Well, hello there, you two," Margaret said, wiping her hands on her old apron. "What brings you over this way?" Emma nudged her little brother forward, whispering something in his ear. Jake took a deep breath, looked straight at Margaret with those big brown eyes that reminded her so much of his daddy, and said the words that would change everything. "You need a friend, and our dad needs a wife." Margaret's heart nearly stopped beating. She looked from one innocent face to the other, not sure whether to laugh or cry. The watering can in her hand suddenly felt heavy as lead. "Oh, honey," she whispered, her voice catching. "What makes you say such a thing?" "'Cause you're always alone," Emma said simply, stepping closer to the fence. "We see you working in your garden every day and you never talk to nobody. And Daddy, well, Daddy cries at night when he thinks we're sleeping. Uncle Robert says you're trouble, but you seem real nice to us." The watering can slipped from Margaret's grip, hitting the ground with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the quiet afternoon. Water spread across the dusty earth like tears. In the distance, she could see curtains twitching in neighbors' windows. Word would spread fast in this small town. It always did. What seemed like a child's innocent game was only the first spark of a storm no one saw coming. Before we continue this emotional story, put in the comments below which city you're watching from. It'll be a pleasure to give your comment a little heart. Now let's continue this exciting story. David Miller sat at his kitchen table, staring at the stack of unpaid bills that seemed to grow taller every week. The coffee in his cup had gone cold hours ago, but he couldn't bring himself to move. 2 years since Sarah passed, and he still felt like he was drowning in responsibilities he never thought he'd face alone. "Daddy?" Emma's voice cut through his thoughts as she and Jake came running through the back door, their cheeks flushed from playing outside. "Yeah, sweetheart?" he said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his tired eyes. "We talked to Mrs. Margaret today," Jake announced proudly. "She's real nice, Daddy. She smells like flowers, and her hands are soft." David's stomach tightened. "You kids shouldn't be bothering the neighbors," he said gently but firmly. "Mrs. Margaret has her own life to worry about." "But Uncle Robert says she's trouble," Emma said, confusion clouding her young face. "He says she's going to try to take our house away." "Is that true, Daddy?" Before David could answer, heavy footsteps echoed across the wooden porch. Robert Miller let himself in without knocking, something that had become his habit since Sarah's passing. His expensive suit looked out of place in the modest farmhouse kitchen. "Speaking of trouble," Robert said, his voice carrying that tone that always made David feel small. "I heard those kids of yours were over bothering that woman again." "David, we've talked about this. She's been divorced twice and word around town is she's looking for her next victim." "Robert, please," David whispered, glancing at the children. "Not in front of them. They need to know the truth," Robert continued, settling into Sarah's old chair like he owned the place. "That woman moved here right after her second divorce, and now she's got her sights set on you and this land. Mark my words, brother. She's calculating every move." David felt his chest tighten with familiar pain. Since Sarah died, Robert had slowly taken control of everything. The finances, the land decisions, even how to raise the children. And every time David tried to object, Robert reminded him of all the help he'd provided during the darkest days. "I think maybe you're being too harsh," David said quietly, but the words felt weak even to him. Robert's eyes hardened. David, you're too trusting. Always have been. That's why I'm here, to protect this family from people who'd take advantage of your grief. As Robert droned on about property values and family reputation, David caught sight of his children's faces. Emma looked confused and hurt, while little Jake seemed to be shrinking into himself. This wasn't the home Sarah had dreamed of for their babies, and when envy is stirred, the lies begin to grow like weeds. Robert Miller wasted no time. The very next morning, he was sitting in Betty's diner on Main Street, nursing his third cup of coffee and speaking in hushed tones to anyone who'd listen. "I'm just worried about my brother, you know," Robert said to Martha, the town's biggest gossip, as she refilled his cup. "That divorced woman next door has been circling like a vulture ever since she moved here. Poor David's still grieving, and she's already got her claws in those innocent children." Martha's eyes widened with interest. "What do you mean exactly?" "Well," Robert leaned in closer, "I heard she's been asking questions about the property values in the area, and yesterday she had those kids over at her place for nearly an hour. What kind of single woman spends that much time with another man's children unless she's got an agenda?" The lie rolled off his tongue so smoothly, even Robert almost believed it himself. Truth was, the children had only talked to Margaret over the fence for maybe 10 minutes, but truth wasn't going to serve his purpose. By lunchtime, the story had grown legs. Margaret was supposedly asking real estate agents about the Miller property. By evening, she was allegedly seen measuring the fence line between their yards. The whispers followed her to the grocery store, where cashiers suddenly turned cold and neighbors avoided eye contact. Meanwhile, David sat in his living room, Emma curled up beside him as they watched an old movie together. His mind kept wandering to what Robert had said about Margaret's intentions. Could his brother be right? David's judgment hadn't been the sharpest since Sarah passed. Maybe he was being naive. "Daddy," Emma said softly, "why does Uncle Robert not like Mrs. Margaret? She was really nice to us." David's heart ached at the innocence in his daughter's voice. "Sometimes grown-ups have different opinions about people, sweetheart. But why would she want to take our house? It's not even pretty enough for someone to steal." The simple wisdom of a child cut straight through Robert's elaborate lies, but David was too worn down by grief and doubt to see it clearly. Robert's voice echoed in his head. "She's calculating every move, looking for her next victim." That night, David found himself standing at his bedroom window, looking across the yard toward Margaret's small house. A single light glowed in her kitchen window. Was she really plotting something? Or was she just another lonely soul trying to get by? For the first time since Sarah's death, David felt torn between his brother's warnings and his own instincts. The seeds of doubt Robert had planted were taking root, and that scared him more than anything. But the lie that was meant to protect him will soon turn into a knife that cuts deep. Margaret felt the cold stares following her everywhere she went, but she couldn't bring herself to ignore the children when they appeared at her fence the next afternoon. Emma's school dress was torn at the knee, and Jake's face was streaked with dried tears. "What happened, honey?" Margaret asked, kneeling down to Emma's level despite the neighbors watching from their porches. "I fell at recess," Emma whispered, "and the school nurse was busy, so they just sent me home. Daddy's at work, and Uncle Robert—" She trailed off, looking scared. "Uncle Robert what, sweetheart? He gets real angry when we bother him," Jake said quietly. "Says we're too much trouble since Mama went to heaven." Margaret's heart broke into 1,000 pieces. Without thinking twice, she opened her gate. "Come on in. Let's get that knee cleaned up proper." Inside her modest kitchen, Margaret gently cleaned Emma's scraped knee while Jake sat at the small table, his eyes wide with wonder at the warm cookies cooling on the counter. This house felt different from theirs. It smelled like fresh bread and felt safe, like Mama's hugs used to feel. "Mrs. Margaret," Emma said softly as Margaret applied a bandage, "why do people say mean things about you? You're nicer than most of the church ladies." Margaret's hands stilled for a moment. "Sometimes people get scared of things they don't understand, baby girl. And sometimes people have their own reasons for wanting others to stay away. But you make us feel better," Jake said through a mouthful of cookie. "Like when Mama used to read us stories." Tears pricked Margaret's eyes. She'd never had children of her own. Both her marriages had ended before that blessing could come. These two precious souls were filling a void she'd carried for years. "Would you like me to read you a story now?" she asked gently. For the next hour, Margaret read from an old book of fairy tales while the children curled up on her couch. When David's truck pulled into his driveway, they reluctantly prepared to leave. "Don't tell Uncle Robert we were here, okay?" Emma whispered urgently. "He said if we bother you anymore, Something bad might happen. As Margaret watched them run across the yard, she noticed Robert's car parked down the street. He'd been watching. Her blood ran cold as she realized the truth. Her kindness toward these innocent children was being twisted into something sinister. That evening, when David came looking for his kids, he found them unusually quiet at dinner. "We had a good day, Daddy," Emma said carefully. "Just played in the yard mostly." But David noticed the fresh bandage on Emma's knee, and something in his gut told him there was more to the story. And the closer she got to the children, the more dangerous her presence became. Sunday service at the community church had just ended when Robert made his move. He'd spent the week carefully planting seeds of doubt among the congregation, and now it was time to harvest the poisonous fruit of his lies. "David," Robert called out loudly as families gathered on the church steps, "we need to talk. Right here, right now." David's face flushed red as every head turned their way. Emma and Jake pressed closer to their father, sensing the storm brewing in Uncle Robert's voice. "Can't this wait until we get home?" David asked quietly, but Robert's expression was stone cold. "No, it cannot wait." Robert's voice carried across the churchyard. "I've been patient long enough, but when my own brother starts disgracing our family name, something's got to be done." The crowd of churchgoers slowed their departure, drawn to the drama unfolding before them. Pastor Williams stepped forward, concerned. "Robert, please," David whispered urgently. "Not in front of the children, not here." "The children need to see this," Robert declared. "They need to understand what happens when a man forgets his responsibilities. David, you've been carrying on with that divorced woman, bringing shame on Sarah's memory and endangering these innocent babies." "That's not true," David's voice cracked with desperation. "I've barely spoken to her." "Don't lie to me." Robert's face twisted with calculated fury. "The whole town's talking about it. How you've been letting her around Sarah's children. How she's got her hooks in you already. Sarah's barely been gone 2 years, and you're ready to replace her with some gold-digging woman who's already buried 2 husbands. Emma started crying as the cruel words hit their mark. Jake buried his face in David's shirt, trembling. "You're wrong," David said, but his voice was weak, broken by public humiliation. "Am I?" Robert pulled out a folded paper from his jacket. "This is the deed to the family land, David. Daddy left it in my name as the eldest son, and I've been letting you stay out of kindness. But I won't watch you destroy everything we've built. You've got until the end of the week to pack up and leave." The crowd gasped. David staggered backward as if he'd been struck. The land had been in their family for 3 generations. He'd assumed it would always be his home. "Robert, please," David begged, his pride crumbling in front of everyone who mattered to him. "Where am I supposed to take my children?" "You should have thought about that before you chose that woman over your family's honor," Robert said coldly, turning his back on his brother's desperate pleas. As the crowd dispersed in uncomfortable whispers, David stood there holding his sobbing children, feeling more alone than he had since Sarah died. But the truth cannot be buried forever, and a single forgotten document will soon rise to the surface. Margaret hadn't been able to sleep since witnessing the horrible scene at church. The image of David's broken face and those poor children crying haunted her every waking moment. She'd heard through the grapevine that the family had just 3 days left before Robert forced them out of their home. Unable to bear the restless anxiety, Margaret decided to clean out her attic, something she'd been putting off since moving in 3 years ago. As she climbed the creaky wooden ladder, dust particles danced in the afternoon sunlight, streaming through the small window. In the far corner sat an old cedar chest she'd inherited from her late father. She'd never had the heart to go through his things properly after the funeral. Her daddy had been a quiet man who worked as a clerk at various businesses around town for over 40 years before he passed. The chest creaked as she opened it, releasing the scent of cedar and old paper. Inside were stacks of documents, old employment records, and yellowed files her father had kept from his years working for different families and businesses. As Margaret carefully lifted each bundle, her hands trembled when she saw a familiar name on a manila folder: Miller Family Estate, Confidential Records, 1995-2010. "Oh my Lord," she whispered, remembering now that her daddy had worked as a clerk for old Mr. Miller, David and Robert's father, during the last 15 years of his life. With shaking fingers, she opened the folder. Inside were property deeds, tax records, and what looked like legal correspondence. But it was a handwritten letter dated just weeks before old Mr. Miller's death that made her heart stop. The letter was addressed to the town lawyer and written in her father's careful script. It detailed concerns about irregularities in the will preparation, and mentioned that Robert had been pressuring his dying father to change the property inheritance. Most shocking of all, the letter stated that the original will left the family land equally to both sons, not solely to Robert, as the eldest. Margaret's hands trembled as she read further. Her father had witnessed Robert forging documents and threatening the old man when he was too weak to fight back. The letter was meant as evidence, but her father had died of a heart attack before he could deliver it to the authorities. Tears streamed down Margaret's face as she realized what she held in her hands, proof that could save David and his children, evidence that would expose Robert's cruel lies and theft. But revealing this truth would mean admitting her father had kept silent about witnessing crimes. It would mean painting a target on her back that could destroy the quiet life she'd worked so hard to rebuild after her 2 failed marriages. She thought of Emma's innocent face and Jake's bright eyes. She thought of David's defeated shoulders as he'd walked away from the church, carrying the weight of public shame that wasn't rightfully his. Yet revealing it would mean risking everything she had just rebuilt. 2 days after the church confrontation, while David was inside packing their few belongings with the heavy weight of defeat on his shoulders, Emma and Jake made a desperate decision. They'd watched their daddy cry himself to sleep each night, and they couldn't bear it anymore. "We gotta tell Mrs. Margaret what's happening," Emma whispered to her little brother as they crept across the yard. "Maybe she can help Daddy somehow." Margaret was sitting on her back porch, still clutching her father's letter, when she saw the 2 small figures approaching through the gathering dusk. Her heart broke all over again at the sight of their tear-stained faces. "Oh, my sweet babies," she said, opening her arms as they ran to her. "What are you doing out here so late?" "Mrs. Margaret," Emma sobbed. "Uncle Robert made Daddy so sad. He said mean things about you in front of everybody, and now we gotta leave our house forever." Jake climbed onto Margaret's lap, his small body shaking with silent tears. "Uncle Robert told us we can't ever talk to you again because you're a bad lady. But you're not bad, are you? You're the nicest person we know since Mama went to heaven." Margaret's heart shattered as she held these precious children close. "No, honey, I'm not bad. Sometimes grown-ups get confused about things, and they say hurtful words they don't really mean." "But why does Uncle Robert hate you so much?" Emma asked, her 8-year-old mind struggling to understand the cruelty she'd witnessed. "You never did anything mean to anybody." "Uncle Robert doesn't want Daddy to have any friends," Jake said, with the startling clarity that sometimes comes from children. "He gets mad when Daddy smiles, or when we laugh too loud. It's like he wants us to be sad all the time." Margaret felt the weight of the letter in her pocket, growing heavier with each innocent revelation. These children were suffering because of Robert's greed and manipulation, and she held the key to their freedom in her hands. "Mrs. Margaret," Emma whispered urgently, "can you pray for us? Uncle Robert says you don't go to church, but we think maybe you still know how to talk to heaven." As Margaret bowed her head with the children, David appeared in his backyard, frantically searching for his kids. When he saw them with Margaret, his first instinct was anger, but then he noticed something that stopped him cold. For the first time in weeks, his children looked peaceful, safe, happy, even through their tears. Standing there in the shadows, watching Margaret gently comfort his babies while they prayed together under the starlit sky, David felt his brother's lies beginning to crack like old paint. And when innocence speaks louder than lies, even the strongest walls begin to crumble. The next morning, David did something that surprised everyone, including himself. With trembling hands, he called for an emergency meeting of the town council. If Robert was going to destroy his family publicly, then the truth, whatever it was, deserved to be heard publicly too. The small community center filled quickly. Word had spread like wildfire that the Miller brothers were going to have it out once and for all. Pastor Williams sat with the 3 council members at a long table, while townspeople packed the folding chairs behind them. Robert strutted in wearing his expensive suit, confidence radiating from every step. He'd prepared for this moment, armed with his forged documents and years of carefully crafted lies. "This is unfortunate," Robert announced to the room, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "My poor brother has been so overcome with grief that he's lost all sense of judgment. He's challenging legal documents that have been in our family for generations, all because he's been manipulated by a woman with questionable intentions." David stood on shaking legs, his voice barely above a whisper. I need to know the truth about our daddy's will. The children deserve to know why we're losing the only home they've ever known." "The truth?" Robert laughed coldly. "The truth is that Daddy knew you weren't responsible enough to handle the family legacy. That's why he left everything to me as the eldest son. These documents prove it." He slammed the papers down on the table with theatrical authority. The crowd murmured, most of them already convinced by Robert's weeks of careful manipulation. David's shoulders sagged under the weight of their judgment. But in the back of the room, Margaret sat clutching her father's letter, her heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe. She'd made her decision during a sleepless night of prayer. These innocent children deserved better than the lies that were destroying their family. "Is there anyone else who wishes to speak?" Pastor Williams asked, following the formal procedures. Margaret rose slowly, her legs unsteady. Every eye in the room turned toward her, some curious, others hostile. Robert's face went pale as she walked toward the front, the yellowed letter visible in her trembling hands. I have something that might shed light on this situation," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Something my late father left behind. He worked as a clerk for Mr. Miller, David and Robert's father during his final years." Robert's confident smirk faltered for just a moment, but he quickly recovered. "This woman has no business interfering in family matters. She's been trying to sink her claws into my brother since the day she moved here." Margaret looked directly at Robert, then at David's hopeful face, then at the two children sitting beside their father with wide, trusting eyes. And when she finally opened her mouth, the entire town held its breath. Margaret's voice carried clearly across the silent room as she began to read her father's letter. "My name is Thomas Henderson, and I'm writing this as a witness to crimes I can no longer keep silent about." The crowd leaned forward, hanging on every word as Margaret revealed her father's careful documentation of forged signatures, altered wills, and backdated documents. But the biggest shock came when she reached the most damaging paragraph. The family lawyer, Mr. Franklin Carey, approached Robert Miller with a proposal, Margaret read, her voice trembling. In exchange for Robert's cooperation in defrauding his younger brother out of his inheritance, Mr. Carey would keep half the proceeds from the eventual sale of the family land. Robert was told this plan would make him wealthy beyond his dreams. The community center erupted in gasps and angry murmurs. Robert's face went from pale to bright red as he jumped to his feet. "That's impossible," he shouted. "Franklin Carey is a respected member of this community. This woman and her dead father are lying." Pastor Williams raised his hand for silence. "Let her finish, Robert." Margaret's hands shook as she continued. "I witnessed Mr. Carey threatening old Mr. Miller when he was too sick to defend himself. The original will clearly states that the family land should be divided equally between both sons. Robert was never meant to inherit everything." The room fell into stunned silence as the truth sank in. David stared at his brother with a mixture of heartbreak and dawning understanding. All these years, Robert hadn't been protecting the family legacy. He'd been stealing it. "But there's more," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. "My father discovered that Mr. Carey had been doing this to other families too. The Henderson farm, the Morrison property, the old Willis place, all stolen through forged documents and greedy partnerships." Emma tugged on her father's sleeve, confusion written across her young face. "Daddy, does this mean we can stay home?" David couldn't speak. The weight of what his brother had done, the lies, the manipulation, the destruction of his family's honor, pressed down on him like a mountain. Robert had let him suffer public humiliation, had been willing to make his own nieces homeless, all for money. Robert stood there, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a costume, his arrogance crumbling into desperate denial. "You can't prove any of this. Where's your evidence? Where's this precious Franklin Carey now?" "He died in a car accident 3 months ago," Pastor Williams said quietly, "right around the time some families started questioning irregularities in their property transfers. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. The community that had judged David so harshly now saw him as the victim he'd always been. But the damage was done. Families torn apart, trust destroyed, innocence shattered. But even with the truth revealed, one question remained. Could forgiveness heal such deep wounds? The silence in the community center stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Then, something broke inside Robert Miller. The proud, arrogant man who had strutted into the room collapsed into a chair, his hands covering his face as years of guilt and shame finally overwhelmed him. "Oh God," Robert whispered, his voice cracking like a broken child's. "What have I done? What have I done to my own family?" The sobs that followed were raw and desperate, the sound of a man who'd lost everything that truly mattered while chasing something that was never real. "David, I'm so sorry. I was so scared of losing everything after Daddy died. When Carey approached me with his scheme, I thought I was protecting our legacy, but I was just a fool, a selfish, terrified fool." David stood frozen, watching his older brother, the man who'd been his hero as a child, fall apart completely. Emma and Jake pressed closer to their father, sensing the seismic shift happening in their small world. "Robert," David said quietly, his voice heavy with years of pain, "you nearly destroyed my children's lives. You made me believe I was worthless, that I didn't deserve our father's love or respect." "I know," Robert sobbed. "I know, and I hate myself for it. But please, David, please don't let my mistakes destroy what's left of our family. These children, they're all we have left of Sarah, of everything good in this world." Margaret stepped forward, her heart aching for both brothers. "David," she said softly, "your children have been through enough suffering. They need to see that love can win over hatred, that families can heal." As the golden sunset painted the community center windows, David made a choice that would echo through generations. He walked to his brother, knelt beside his chair, and placed a gentle hand on Robert's shoulder. "I forgive you," David whispered, and those 3 words seemed to lift a weight from the entire room. "But things gotta change, Robert. No more lies, no more manipulation. We start over. Clean slate." Emma and Jake ran to their uncle, their innocent hearts unable to hold onto anger. As Robert embraced his niece and nephew, tears of genuine remorse streaming down his face, the community witnessed something more powerful than justice. They witnessed redemption. Margaret stood beside David, no longer the outsider looking in, but a woman who'd found her place in a story that began with 2 children's simple words about friendship and love. Pastor Williams closed the meeting with a prayer of thanksgiving, and as the families walked home under the first stars of evening, the Miller land finally returned to its rightful heirs, seemed to breathe with new hope. Because in the end, envy destroys, but forgiveness has the power to transform everything, and sometimes even a child's innocent words carry the weight of destiny. This story reminds us that sometimes the most profound changes in our lives begin with the simplest moments: a child's innocent words, a neighbor's act of kindness, or the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it costs us everything. Margaret could have stayed silent, protecting her quiet life and letting injustice continue. But she chose to risk everything for the sake of 2 innocent children and a broken man who'd lost his way. In our own lives, how often do we have the chance to speak truth into someone's darkness, but we choose silence because it's safer? The Miller family's story shows us that forgiveness isn't about forgetting the pain or pretending the wounds don't exist. It's about choosing to build something new from the ashes of what was destroyed. Robert's greed nearly cost him everything that truly mattered, but even in his darkest moment, grace was waiting to transform his story. David learned that sometimes the people we trust most can be the ones who hurt us deepest, but healing is still possible when we're brave enough to face the truth. What about your own life? Are there relationships you've given up on that might still hold the possibility of healing? Have you been carrying the weight of someone else's lies about who you are, like David carried the shame of accusations that were never true? Or maybe you're like Margaret, standing on the sidelines of someone's struggle, holding the key to their freedom but afraid to get involved. Here's what I want you to ask yourself tonight. What innocent moment in your life might be calling you to step into someone else's story with courage and compassion? What truth are you afraid to speak because it might cost you your comfort? And who in your world needs to hear that they're worthy of love, respect, and a fresh start? Don't let this story end here in your heart. Take action. Reach out to that family member you've been avoiding. Speak truth to that situation you've been ignoring. Choose forgiveness over bitterness, courage over comfort, love over fear. If this story touched your heart and made you think about the power of truth and forgiveness in your own life, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss these powerful stories that remind us who we're really meant to be. And click on that video appearing on your screen right now to continue watching more engaging stories that will inspire you to live with greater courage, love, and purpose.